passati, tutto ritorna come prima. Amiamoci, coi 3 punti esclamativi.
Milioni di spettatori conoscono i film di Zavattini, ma pochi immaginano com'è Zavattini uomo.
Perfetto.
E a Cuba mi sono trovato di fronte niente di meno che alla rivoluzione. Un piccolo borghese come ero io, che era arrivato lì e vedeva la rivoluzione tutte le volte che apriva la finestra. È stata una emozione dalla quale veramente mi domandavo ogni tanto se ne ero all'altezza.
Signore e signori, buonasera and benvenuti a tutti a casa. We are delighted to have you here with us tonight, and we're very excited about the topic of this evening. We're going to talk about neorealism in Latin America. As you know, neorealism is the Italian film movement, call it as you wish, that really shaped not only Italian cinematography, but world cinematography. And we have the fortune of having with us David Brancaleone of the Limerick Institute of Technology, and to interview David about his new book, we have Alfonso Aguado, who is a PhD student in our Department of Italian Studies. We are very proud of our PhD students, and you'll realize why when you listen to him and to the colleagues that will come after him. And we think this is a fundamental topic, like to really look at the ramifications of neorealism way beyond its temporal borders that are normally accepted, the bookends, 1945, 1952, according to the dogma, and way beyond its geographic borders of the city of Rome or the surrounding area. So we are delighted to have this conversation, and I can't wait to listen to it along with you. Alfo, il microfono è tuo.
Grazie, Stefano, grazie. Welcome everyone. I'm very excited to host this event. So thank you to Stefano and to everyone at Casa Italiana for giving me this platform. And we're here to present a new book by David Brancaleone, whom we have here in the screen. Brancaleone is a multifaceted scholar. After studying art history and English at the University of Rome, La Sapienza, and having a professional career as a graphic designer, actually, he went back to graduate school, earning an MA in Italian Studies from UCL in London, and finally a doctorate from the Warburg Institute with a dissertation on Ramon Llull. After teaching at the University of Wales, he became a professor at the Limerick Institute of Technology in Ireland, where since 2006, he teaches film studies, art history, and visual culture in the Critical and Contextual Studies Department. And we're here presenting his most recent book on Cesare Zavattini, titled Zavattini, il neo-realismo e il nuovo cinema latino-americano. It's a fantastic book. It's a 2-volume book, actually, that studies the influence of Zavattini in Latin American cinema, tracing his trips to Cuba and Mexico, as well as his connection to the Argentinian new cinema that emerged in the 1950s. And this book is only one of the many publications that are coming out from Brancaleone's extensive research, as we will discuss later. The other being an exhibition catalog. We'll talk briefly about it, Zavattini Oltre i Confini, and also a new cultural biography of Zavattini that is going to come out in English, and an edited volume of his selected writings also in English. Coming soon. So thank you, Professor Brancaleone, for being here. And yeah, first of all, I just wanted to ask, why Zavattini? I'm just curious, how did you come to this character? He's a fascinating figure.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to be with your viewers, your listeners, to be able to talk about Zavattini. I was in 2010 years ago, I needed to do some filmmaking, And I didn't know how to do it, although I'd done a lot of photography, commissioning art, commissioning photography, did illustrations myself, but never actually learnt filmmaking. So I started finding out about that, and I came across a book, L'Officina del Reale, by Mario Balsamo and Gianfranco Pannone, Fare un documentario, dalla progettazione al film. So a practical book, which was based on an MA course. But the amazing thing about this book is that Zavattini keeps being mentioned. And also this book records the seminar discussions the students had with their professors, which means that it's extremely interesting. You get all these different angles, these different points of view. So, but I was surprised that Zavattini, I knew of Zavattini as the screenwriter of famous neorealist films, Shusha, Miracle in Milan, Umberto D would be the most famous. He also wrote the story for Bellissima, Visconti's Bellissima, Prima Comunione.
Tetto, La Ciociara. He was behind all of the neorealist classics. He's almost one of the founding fathers of neorealism.
Yeah, so I knew that. I knew some of that. And then I knew that, he wrote, in his late years, he wrote, articles in newspapers, he praised it here and so on. But I didn't really know much more about him. So I learned, what I found out was actually that young documentary filmmakers in Italy sort of held him in high esteem. Yes. So I started looking into that, and I started filmmaking, which would be, if you like, documentary shorts. And I practiced the ideas that came out of these books. What Zavattini were they talking about? And I soon realized that it was not the neorealist Zavattini that I was familiar with. It was another Zavattini. There was a hidden universe that was worth finding out about. I was very, very curious.
That's great.
So there's the answer.
That's a great anecdote, actually. And that's one of the things that I wanted to ask you, because one of the most impressive things of your work is the archival research that you do. I think that, and we'll talk about that. Maybe I can speak how I got to know this book on the first place for a minute. But I was in Italy, actually. I was in Naples earlier this year, before the pandemic hit. I was doing preliminary research for my dissertation. I was still very confused about what I was working on, as my advisor knows. But I did know that I was interested in the impact of neorealism abroad, and how neorealism had been disseminated in the Hispanic nations, in the Spanish-speaking nations. And all of a sudden I enter Feltrinelli, I think it was, or one of Feltrinelli-like store, and I come across these two books, which are massive, which are new, and I was very surprised. And the most impressive thing of your book particularly is how well researched it is, and how much it's based on the archive, on your archival findings. It is a very well-grounded book on the materials that you found. So I wanted to, maybe you could talk about that, about your experience in the Zavattini archive in Reggio Emilia. How was it dealing with that massive amount of documents?
Well, I had experience in working in archives before. Okay, so I was in Rome, and I found out about this place called the Archivio Audiovisivo del Movimento Operaio.
Yeah, AMOD.
It's an archive, AMOD.
Yeah.
And then they were, in the 1990s, they were told to add "e democratico."
Yeah, exactly. Because basically, AMOD is the audiovisual archive of the Communist Party in Italy that has evolved into this institution.
But guess who the first president of the AMOD was?
Cesare.
He was. Yes, he was. And this, in a way, the archive is born from Zavattini archiving everything he does. He starts when he's 26 in 1928. There are letters from 1928 that are in his archive. There are hundreds of thousands of documents in that archive. It's the working papers of everything he ever worked on, whether it became a film or a book or a poem or a story or not. It's all there. Even the conversations, even the little bits of paper that you get used to get in hotels when somebody phones. Oh, excuse me, Alfo, there's a message for you. Here it is. Thank you. even those messages
That's
are in
impressive.
that archive. It's
Yeah.
extraordinary. So I was used to working in archives, and as I began to read about Zavattini, if you like, the secondary literature, I came across, if you like, what was entirely new to me was the fact that there was this people in Italy who were far more knowledgeable about him, having either known him or worked closely with him or something, and then everybody else. So these were the people to approach. So amongst these people was this unit of this archive in Rome, and somebody there said to me, David, look, you've got to go to Reggio. What are you doing? You're wasting your time with secondary stuff. Nobody knows anything about this guy. They only know about his work as a screenwriter for these 4 films, and then there's a sort of vulgata. There's this story of Zavattini, of who he's supposed to be, a representation of his work, which doesn't really, how can I put it? It doesn't really fit in with what he actually did and what he actually wrote and his achievements. So I said, okay, I went to Reggio, and
did you know, David, that you wanted to work on Latin America and his Latin American connections, or at this point you were only interested in Zavattini?
At this point, what happened is, so the Latin American book was because as I was working on, I got a contract with Bloomsbury Academic for 2 books, 2 volumes of selected writings and a biography. So you could see from the structure of that I, from the beginning, even before the Latin American book, I was thinking in terms of, how can I put it? I don't know how to put it, head, heart, and hand. This idea that you need to connect things, you need to look at the whole picture. How can you look at the whole picture if you don't listen to what the evidence is telling you? So where is the evidence? It's in the archive. This guy was a born archivist. He already had a very carefully put together archive from the 1930s. He burnt some papers from the 1930s because he was worried under fascism that he could be arrested for some of the things he'd written in correspondence. But apart from that gap, basically most of the 20th century is in his archive. He knew loads of people. So the real problem was, how do you deal with an archive? Well, the first thing is a finding aid. So nowadays it's an online finding aid. So then you discover that, okay, this archive is organized according to his film writings, his stories, anything to do with cinema, and then, correspondence and so on. So categorized in a particular way. So you start doing that and you soon realize that that doesn't work.
That doesn't work, yeah.
Because actually anywhere, you might find something anywhere. You might find a letter with a reference to something else that you're writing about, which is very important.
Yeah,
so then you have to basically invent your own finding aid, or you have to re-theorize how you're going to work in the archive. So it's a bit like, I don't know, changing the menu.
Yeah.
You've got, for some food, this is the menu. I'm sorry, that doesn't work. It's too salty, it's too peppery, there's too much aglio, there's too much,
So then you come to the conclusion that there's like this, and I think you talk about this in the introduction, that there's like this gap in the understanding of Zavattini and his life and his connections with the nuovo cinema latino-americano, the new Latin American cinema of the 60s. In a way, your book, I think an interesting thing that your book is doing is that it's connecting what we commonly know as the Latin American cinema of the 1960s with the previous decade through the figure of Zavattini. Like everything that was going on in the 60s in Latin America had been in a way seeded by Zavattini, who was like almost this ambassador, this missionary of the neo-realist credo to Latin America. And he had done all this work, and that's a story that some scholars have worked on. Some episodes, particularly the Cuban, have been explored, but it had never been explored in a comprehensive way, in the way you did it. And just like, so that we can get started with the book, just for our listeners, the book is divided in 3 parts. I wouldn't call them chapters because they're big sections, 3 sections. One is Zavattini and Cuba. The other one is focused on Mexico, and the third one in Argentina. And the book begins with almost with an anecdote, with an episode. That is Zavattini in the 1953 conference in Parma, which is a famous conference that maybe you can talk a little bit more about, where almost one could say neorealism died, or the canonical period of neorealism died in Parma. And Zavattini left early from that conference in Parma to fly to Cuba and begin his Latin American adventures. So tell us about like this moment. Tell us about how neorealism got to the Parma moment in 1953. What happened to the movement, and why Zavattini needed to escape Italy. And
okay, I can start with 1949, which is a few years earlier. At the 1949 Perugia, there was a conference in Perugia in 1949. And at that conference, Lizzani gave a paper which is not in his reminiscences for the Novecento. I don't know where I have it here. Oh, here we are. Yeah, Attraverso il Novecento. So this is a book.
That's great.
Essays and stories and whatever by Lizzani. You try and find his conference paper in here. It's not here. There's a reason why it's not here, because the conference paper is in the conference paper Collectanea published by Umberto Barbaro in 1949, but he made sure it wouldn't appear in this. Why? Because what he says, what Carlo Lizzani says at the conference is, look, neorealism, that's fine. This is 1949. Look, we've got to tell more stories. Look, basically we have to make Hollywood cinema. Yeah. Otherwise the producers won't, so that was his position in 1949. And really, so Lizzani was a card-carrying Communist Party member. Zavattini was a communist. Today you would call him a social democrat, because he was a pacifist. So for him, a revolution would have to be a cultural revolution. So Zavattini stood for, if you like, an emancipatory cinema. Yeah.
He was a fellow traveler of the party, as they say.
But there's a big difference. And the line of distinction begins in 1949 and even earlier. On the one hand, you have Zavattini, who is talking about, shifting from Méliès back to Lumière. The Lumière brothers, who, some people object to that distinction that Zavattini made between the early cinema, the pioneer cinema of the Lumière brothers, and and on the other hand, the pioneering cinema of Méliès. So Méliès stood for a cinema of invention, of mise en scène, imagination, and, if you like, fiction, and the Lumière brothers famously for non-fiction. People have criticized that and said, oh, that's not true, they did fiction as well. But if you actually look at the statistics, 3/4, 75% of the Lumière brothers' work was non-fiction. So he said we need to look, cinema in all its history has really developed this line, which is the Méliès line. It's time to rethink cinema. He says this in 1949 at Perugia. Yeah. That's his line in 49. By 1953, what happens? 53 is a big year. It culminates in that conference of Parma. But in that year, he does several things, all, if you like, gelling and forming a sort of a whole vision, if you like, bringing together theory and practice, filmmaking as an intellectual endeavor, an intellectual practice, and filmmaking as an intellectual also endeavor, theoretical theorizing. So theorizing while making, theorizing while writing, theorizing while imagining, theorizing while investigating. What does he do? He acts as a producer, executive producer, as well as a screenwriter. And he puts together a film. He brings together several people to make We Women in 1953, okay, which is a diary film. That was the intention. It was a diary film, and it's one line of investigation that he was trying to develop. The other line of investigation was a documentary film, which was Love in the City. So those two films came out before the Conference of Parma.
Yeah.
So by the time the Conference of Parma is on, he has been severely attacked in the communist press. And those attacks only get worse, and they conflagrate in Parma and get even worse after Parma. So there are these lines.
Just so that our viewers know that, because Love in the City is an important film for our discussion. It's a film, it's an episodic film in which many filmmakers participated. I would say it's between documentary and fiction. It's all episodes are real situations, real anecdotes or events that happened in the city of Rome, but they are fictionalized or restaged by actors. And one of them, one of the most important episodes in that film, was done by Zavattini himself. La Storia di Caterina. Am I right?
That's right, yes. But the difference is that, okay, La Storia di Caterina was originally going to be the only film. It was going to be a film short. It was going to be what he called a film lampo, like a flash, like a flash of lightning, a lightning film. And the idea was to collapse the gap between an idea, an event, and filming the event. Could cinema catch up with itself? And the answer was no, it couldn't. So he wanted to push cinema as a, you know, and we're not talking here about industry only, we're talking about filmmaking, okay? Yeah. Could it be pushed so that films could be made almost on the hoof immediately after the event? Could the event be recorded? Could it become a film with frames and sound and everything it needs, but done more quickly? So La Storia di Caterina initially was a film lampo, theorized as a film lampo. He himself and a few other people went to the trial of this single mother who'd had this baby and then abandoned the baby. So there's a huge scandal in Italy about this. You know, all over the world, the Catholic Church has for decades until recently, you know, locked women up as criminals for having babies if they're single. Yes. And so imagine in 1952, when this actually happened, what a scandal this was. He wasn't interested in it because it was a scandal. No. It was, if you like, symptomatic. Zavattini worked with symptoms, like a medical doctor who thinks in terms of symptoms. What is this symptomatic of? Yeah. Now, that is, if you like, something that was misunderstood or not understood by the communist filmmakers of the time, and very well understood by the Catholic film critics of the time, and something that both parties wanted to avoid.
Because I guess that the film is kind of has a humanistic approach to Caterina, like an empathetic approach to her tragedy, but at the same time it does see it as a tragedy. It's not like an economic criticism of what drew Caterina to do that. It's more just like this human, empathic view of the woman.
That's true. Again, one has to always be very careful with Zavattini because there's always more to meet the eye. We have to remember, I have to constantly remind myself that we're talking about somebody who was a media mogul. I don't know if you've seen the Netflix, what is it, Mad Men, Madison Men. It's a TV series, very well done TV series. So he was a madman in that sense. In the sense of being a media mogul. This is somebody who waved his magic wand and turned a pulp fiction magazine, which would only sell maybe 1,000 copies, into an 80,000 copy production. So he, in the 1930s, between 1930 and 1940, he was an editorial director for two major Italian magazine publishers, Rizzoli first and then Mondadori. He started his career as, if you like, almost, what should we call him, a commissioning editor. Yeah. So you're talking about somebody who had managerial abilities, not just, business savvy, but also, not only about that, but also the vision of somebody who can think, can do project management, can think in terms of the layers of communication, of meaning, of what it is you want to say, and how to filter what you want to say depending on your audience, which is, you know, not bad for the 1930s.
It's very good. But David, but going back to your book, so let's situate ourselves. We're in 1953. Zavattini travels to Cuba, and he's going to develop like a quite an intense relationship with Cuba and with Cuban intellectuals. I think he travels before the revolution, between 1953 and 1959. I think he travels like at least 3 times, maybe 4.
Okay, so I suppose it's best to end Parma. So Parma ends. Zavattini arrives on the 5th of December in Cuba. He's that neorealism is the conscience of cinema. That nobody wants. They don't want to do that. Go back. They want to make neorealismo rosa. They want to do what they did before the war. They want to do something else. He tells them it's the conscience of cinema. Luigi Chiarini, who's one of the people running the conference, refers to him as l'imputato, the accused. Zavattini really galvanized that conference because he offered a different approach to cinema, which was based not on, if you like, he was accused of turning cinema into an anecdotal, descriptive, crepuscular. He was told that he was being crepuscular, that he wanted to tell insignificant stories.
Yeah.
And his response is what takes him outside Italy, where although, you know, film historians tell us that 53 is the final year. 1952, Umberto D, you know, the death throes of neorealism. Actually, Umberto D was written in 1948.
Mm-hmm.
And Zavattini says that he wrote that Umberto D was actually closer to his pre-war thinking on cinema.
Yeah.
So he already thought about durational cinema. So he goes to Cuba, and he is met by young filmmakers, 2 of which had studied at the Centro Sperimentale in Rome.
Which are Tomás Gutiérrez Alea and Julio García Espinosa.
Yeah.
2 Cubans, because it's important to say that the Centro Sperimentale in Rome was not only one of the most important film schools in Europe, but it also attracted people from all over the globe. Yeah. And a lot of Latin American intellectuals would go to Rome to study cinema, among others, Garcia Marquez, the Nobel Prize.
Absolutely.
writer.
So he goes to Cuba. The first thing that happens is he is told, he is asked this question: how did Parma go? What was the outcome of the Parma conference? Mm-hmm. He is absolutely astonished. So he comes into contact with, if you like, a film culture which is very refined and very up to date with European and particularly Italian filmmaking, because the University of La Havana had a deal with Museum of Modern Art, with MoMA, and was getting films from Paris and from New York, actually, and had built a whole collection of film history. The students there, and even the young professors, like some of them were young professors, like Alfredo Guevara and other people, and Jose Masip, who were young professors, were absolutely familiar with what was going on. They were familiar with they understood the questions that Zavattini was addressing. And if the Italians were, you know, accusing him of being anecdotal or picking on small, insignificant things and insisting on making a cinema of insignificance, the Cubans immediately understood what was on offer. They wanted to make cinema, and Zavattini appears. He is immediately invited into a conference-type situation. Fortunately, the conference papers were first partly translated by Stefania Parigi's group of editors many years ago, in 2002, for a special edition of a magazine, Bianco e Nero, and I found other papers relating to that, and it is possible to reconstruct what that conference was.
Yeah.
What came out of that conference is very, if you like, socialist.
Yeah.
Because I can just pick out one intervention by a woman dressed in green who who says, well, you know, what are we talking about? So she's talking about ideals, idealism, the future, emancipation in very humanist way. Okay.
Yeah.
And this is where we have to rethink even this tag of humanism,
Yeah.
which is given to Zavattini. He responds by bringing it back to the concrete reality, the reality of things, of statistics, of facts. Now, he did that at Parma, but he was ignored, because what he did at Parma is he referred to an should we say, a report, which has also been partly, there was also a documentary about this report, which is available online on YouTube, on the conditions of poverty in Italy. And so the report ran from 1951 to 1954, 55 in several volumes. Zavattini quoted from that report at Parma, saying, this is the reality cinema needs to address.
Yeah, here are the films are here. The films
this is what
are
I'm talking, exactly.
here.
This
And
is
then,
what
of
I'm
course,
talking about.
Of course, when he arrived to Italy, to Cuba, excuse me, he almost found like the perfect situation for Zavattini, because on the one hand, there was all these social issues, this extreme poverty in which the island was submitted to under Batista, that had to be addressed by the camera. At the same time, as you were saying, there was an intelligentsia, film intelligentsia, that was sophisticated, that was well educated, that he could engage with. And at the same time, there was no national film industry. Cuba had no national cinema. The Cubans would consume either Hollywood, European cinema, or Mexican and Argentinian cinema. So it's almost like the perfect setting for somebody like Zavattini to just like spark something that became very important later.
I think one of the problems we have with interpretation and trying to read a situation is we keep forgetting to look at the material interests involved. So the material interests involved in Italy, you know, I suppose we should talk of vested interests.
Yeah.
So the vested interests, or if you like, the economic base of a situation, you know, is there and it needs to be appreciated. So in Italy, in the film industry, there was, you know, there were different positions, and Zavattini is the unwelcome position, because he is, you know, Ferlino Michiché, he is the person who, if you like, brought ethics at the center of cinema. But I would actually contend that he does more than that. He brings politics in, you know, what kind of cinema of politics can you make that is not going to be a crashing bore, that is not going to be didactic until we slam the door in just boredom and annoyance at somebody who is, you know, driving their story down our throats. So is there an alternative to that? So in Cuba, Zavattini, he goes there 3 times. He goes there in 1953. He's back in 1955 to see El Megano, which was the film the Cubans made on his model.
Yeah.
They take Zavattini's ethnographic filmmaking model, which is what he develops, if you like, it's the line within neorealism that he privileges, which is the documentary line.
Yeah.
And he takes that line towards ethnography, using certain keywords like shadowing, meaning following people into their lives.
Pedinamento.
Pedinamento, which actually has been ridiculed, you know, or it's been misunderstood. For example, you know, this is a classic book, Lessico Zavattiniano, right? So there's an essay there on pedinamento, but it's almost like a gimmick. It's almost as if it's a gimmick. But we forget that actually this guy had been a media mogul. This was a publisher in fieri, constantly, you know, thinking along different lines of communication. He was a pioneer of visual culture in Italy in terms of criticism, the equivalent of Krakauer in Germany, or you know, or Walter Benjamin in Germany as well. Zavattini in those same years was pre-war, was writing about visual culture, you know. So this is the guy who goes back to Cuba with a proposal for an ethnographic cinema, which he calls Cuba Mia.
Yeah.
Now, we know that because in 2002, the first director, the founding director of the Cuban Film Institute, ICAIC, Instituto Cubano and so on, wrote a kind of memoir in which he included a translation made in 1953 or early 54 of Zavattini's Some Ideas on the Cinema. And he includes also his own script based on Zavattini's ideas for Cuba Mia.
Yeah.
So the Cuba Mia and El Megano, which were, if you like, written and thought out at the same time, were Zavattini's project, which was, if you like, I don't know how to put it, given to the Cubans who were asking for guidance as to how to make a new cinema. One should also say that you could measure the transfer of ideas, the transmission of ideas from the reception. It's not only interesting, some people in the past have talked about Zavattini as saying things, communicating things, transmitting, but actually transmission sounds like a one-way alley. Actually, if we consider Paulo Freire's writings on how we communicate and how to teach and learn and so on, it should be two-way.
Yeah.
So with Zavattini, it's actually two-way. So if we look at the transmission of learning, we should also, or knowledge, and bodies of knowledge is what we're talking about, we also need to consider how they were received. Now in Cuba, what happens in 54 is there's a series of conferences, papers given by the young filmmakers in the Nuevo Tiempo film club. One of them was specifically about neorealism as a model of film practice to be adopted by the new Cuban cinema. So when you read that, you basically, you can see how very pragmatically the Cubans understood what was on offer. They understood that here was a model of practice that could be taken and was, freely given by Zavattini, could be applied to Cuba. Now, the problem was, of course, there was a dictatorship, and there were big difficulties. Fast forward to 1959, Zavattini is the very first person that Alfredo Guevara contacts on the 1st of January, 1959, even before that. And he says, look, can you help us? We've won the revolution. We've won the revolution.
I wanted to go there. I wanted to go there before moving away from Cuba. I worry about time.
Time.
But I think that's such an interesting moment. Zavattini, I think, as I said, like your book is divided in 2 volumes. I don't know if I said this, but the first volume is like your work properly, your thesis book. And the second volume is the amount of primary sources that you consulted, that you were kind enough to compile in a book that is now accessible for us. And it's impressive how quick Zavattini jumps into the revolution, so to speak. I think he writes a letter on January the 2nd to Alfredo Guevara, and they start developing connections so that Zavattini is going to go to the new revolutionary Cuba and see what can they do with cinema over there. And I would like if you could talk briefly on an anecdote that you relate in the book that is fascinating to me. That is that I think that's like his longest period in Cuba. Zavattini goes like for 3 or 4 months.
Yeah.
Like between the end of 59 and the beginning of 1960. And they have like a series of conferences, discussions, and at the very end, there's like almost this ideological clash between 2 sectors of the ICAIC, the Institute of Filmmaking in Cuba. One are the pro-Castro intellectuals that are Guevara, Garcia Espinosa, and Zavattini actually sides with them. And on the other side, you have Cabrera Infante and Nestor Almendros, like these 2 super famous Cuban intellectuals. Almendros was actually Spanish. He went to Cuba on exile. And it's almost like this, it's a clash between realism and formalism, or a clash between a cinema that focuses on content, on social issues, and a cinema that is more poetic and that is more, if you want, French new wave model. Yeah, I know this is a big issue, but if you could, you could just like talk about this anecdote briefly.
So Zavattini is hired in May 1959 to help with organizing and setting up ICAIC.
Yes.
On various levels, not just screenwriting, not just writing stories. So he's hired to do several tasks, one of which is teaching. Mm-hmm. So he runs a seminar, he starts a seminar, which they then call, the Cubans called Seminario Zavattini, which starts on the 11th of December and runs through till the end of February when he leaves. That was the workshop where the tensions were there. So Zavattini basically says, okay, look, right here you have a situation where there's been a revolution. The revolution, he says, is an ongoing thing. It's aiming to do something. It hasn't done that yet. So we know, for example, that there's a agrarian revolution. We know that the lands are being redistributed. Yeah. So that is something filmmakers need to get involved in.
To document, almost.
Document. So he was faced with, if you like, the contingent reality of the revolution is this. Here are the priorities that you need to address. And so the objection was, but what about Jack Kerouac's Alienation and On the Road and Ionesco's theater of the absurd, and this sense of what should we call it? There's a word for it, of alienation, of anomie. That's the word, anomie. And so yes, fine. That's fine in the US. Why? Because they don't have a revolution. You've got intellectuals, writers, creative people, filmmakers, and so on, who are faced with a situation where what they can do is object against the system. They can make films which talk about the impact of living in a capitalist society on individuals and groups. And that's right. That's what they should be doing. That's what they're doing. That's great. However, we're not in New York, we're in Cuba. Exactly. Right? We're in Cuba. So in Cuba, we're surrounded by something that's going on right now, and that is what you need to attend to. So he says alienation is fine in that other context.
It's so interesting because this debate is like the replica of the debates that were going on in France between like the most committed intellectuals and the new wave Cahiers du Cinéma critics. The same thing was going on in Spain. This was like the ongoing discussion throughout the world, and it's so interesting that in Cuba, Zavattini not only was the protagonist of this debate, but also the stakes were so much higher. Like the stakes were so high because the revolution had actually happened, and you had to take sides at that moment.
Yeah, and then after he leaves, so if you like, this clash precedes a clash that happens a year later after he leaves. A film was made by Cabrera's sister. She was a filmmaker. She made a film which is very nice. It's a bit like Lionel Ragozin's film about a street of drunks in New York. Yeah. It's a really nice film. It's really cool. It's very much a kind of film of, I don't know, people in a room, in a bar and sitting around, and, it's durational, which would be a Zavattini thing, but it got a lot of flack because just then there was a heightening of tension between Cuba and the United States, and the Cuban crisis and the Bay of Pigs was not far off in the invasion, the attempted invasion of Cuba by the US through Cuban exiles hadn't yet happened, but the tension was getting stronger and stronger. So at that point, this film about a bar and the street and so on, it didn't help. So, but the whole argument and the whole, if you like, debate and that that ensued, this film, and then it was banned by the CAI because it didn't appear and so on. We can see that's also on YouTube. That film sparked off a debate that had already happened. And even recently, a scholar has written about that episode, but obviously is not familiar with the fact that that whole debate, the whole, if you like, critique that was there had already been addressed by Zavattini in his seminar for in the previous year.
That's interesting.
So, and the real issue was, okay, for him, he was saying, okay, so how do you deal with reality? He wasn't saying you have to have a gritty reality type film. His understanding of mimesis, which is a good word to use for realism, because realism is such a vague term. What do we mean by realism? We won't even go there because it's such a big discussion. But what he understood was that you have to filter reality. So you need a poetic element. And when he was in Cuba, he wrote a story, a scenario called Color contra Color, color against color. And the idea was that these people, these two artists, one was abstract, one was figurative artist, they're holed up in a house and they can't leave because of what's going on around them. Because, if you like, the fight to the revolution is going on and they are stuck there. So they have this debate. So it creates this very tense situation where they have this debate. So the real life history, the passing moment, the present moment is going on around them, but it's filtered by their debate. So he's saying, and he's constantly telling the Cubans, look, yes, they had all these stories for films, right? There's a whole collection of stories they wrote before he arrived, and he went through them all and said, okay, there's a problem here because, you just want to tell an event, you want to describe an event, which is historical, it's recent, it happened. We know that, it's important, we know that, but it's not a film. It's not going to be a film. It's of no interest.
Yeah.
So they had this need to tell the history. And he says, no, that's not no good. So in a way, there is the beginning of the new Latin American cinema right there, at least in terms of Cuba. Absolutely. Because, how did the Cubans then go? Where did they go? That's exactly where they went.
Yeah, and I mean, and at the end, like the intellectuals that sided more with Ionesco, if you will, or with the more abstract or poetically free understanding of the arts, went on exile. They had to leave Cuba eventually. So it is clear who won that battle. There's that famous speech by Fidel Castro where he says, I think it's like addressed to the intellectuals. That's the name of the speech. And he says, like, inside the revolution, everything, but against the revolution, nothing. And all those intellectuals that were like more bourgeois, if you want, or more poetically driven had to leave the island. So they lost that battle.
Well, you see, there's one thing I would just point out. One thing is you use the word poetry. So poetry in ancient Greek comes from poieo, which means to make, right? Making. Yeah. So poetry means making. Poetry is very important for Zavattini because it doesn't mean poetry as we generally understand it. It means making in relation to what is going on. So for him, he was talking about poetic neorealism, but also critical neorealism. Then later on, Birri picks up on this critical neorealism and turns it into his manifesto. But actually, Zavattini had long before that theorized critical neorealism. Yeah. If you like, a neorealism with a emancipatory edge, with more bite to it, and even less compromising. Yeah. So for him, poetry can be uncompromising. So if we say poetic, maybe we mean literary.
Okay? Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah, literary. But actually, so for him, even literary is a term that would be, for him would be, okay, he says, look, it's no good. You're a screenwriter, you're a filmmaker. What are you doing in the studio? What are you doing in your office? Exactly. Get out. Go in the
streets.
Meet people, talk to them.
Yeah.
He does that in Cuba.
Capture what's going on. Yeah.
He says, oh, we want to write a story about this guy who was killed. So Zavattini goes to the place where this guy was killed, he talks to people who knew him, he gets to talk to eyewitnesses, and then he writes in his diary the story, the scenario, through the words that he's been told, and he puts together a story. So there is the use of, I don't know, literary skills to weave together the words that are needed, and at the same time there is, if you like, the, I don't know, the aesthetic of the passing moment,
exactly,
of somehow filming, because he was also very visual, filming something as it's going on. Now he couldn't do that because he, you know, that was impossible, but he could put that into words.
Yeah, exactly. And he could defend that was like the mission of this new cinema. The mission was to capture reality as it was going on. Like, it was like almost this, this apprehensive understanding of cinema.
At the same time, you know, for about, I don't know how many years, 40 years, 50 years, at least half a century, maybe more, there's this big misunderstanding, which led to, you know, one of the founding fathers of post-war theory, André Bazin, being, if you like, marginalized or ridiculed. And on the other hand, Siegfried Kracauer, the other important figure in cinema theory and film philosophy, if you like, both of them were given a really hard time until relatively recently. Kracauer, only the last 10 years, has been, what's the word, rehabilitated. That's the Soviet word. So Kracauer has been rehabilitated, and so has Bazin. Somewhere I have it. There's a book, I'm sure you've come across it. I don't know where it is, you know. Oh, here it is. You'd think this was deliberate. It's deliberate that it's there, but I didn't quite remember where I put it. And I wasn't going to, but this book, okay, opening Bazin. Okay, so this is a book where Bazin is rehabilitated. And one of the worst critics is none other than Colin McCabe, who'd written a scorching essay against Bazin's aesthetics in the 1970s, right? Very famous in every anthology. So Bazin is rehabilitated, Kracauer is rehabilitated. How were they understood and what were they actually doing? They were understood as naive realists. And this concept of naive realism has been, if you like, a sort of slur on both Bazin and Kracauer. Kracauer only recently has been rehabilitated, same for Bazin. That naive realist idea is the idea that these people, including Zavattini, were, if you like, arguing that reality has to be captured in an unfiltered way without any intermediary. Now, that debate was 1930s debate. These people,
it's like a naive understanding of what the cinema apparatus, what it can do and it cannot do, because it's obviously mediated. Whatever you capture, it's obviously going to be mediated by the camera crew, by the camera person. What you leave out of the editing process, that is up. But as you say, that's like it sounds like such an old school debate in film theory.
It's actually a 1930s debate that goes back to Rudolf Arnheim and other people, you know, Umberto Barber to some extent, and other people as well. But certainly, you know, it's in a way, I don't know, structuralism and post-structuralism, these debates suddenly become very important. And in some way they confuse the issue. So anyway, that's maybe gone off on a tangent, but
no, it's useful. I'm very sorry to say that we only have a few more minutes left, so I don't think we're gonna have time to go through his Mexican experience and his Argentinian experience.
I can tell you two things in 5 minutes, no problem.
Let's do it. Let's do very quickly, like in two very quick tweet-like.
Okay, I'll do that. So Mexico, he goes to Mexico, and the Mexican film industry ignores him totally. They don't want to see him. They don't want to know him. They don't turn up. They're absent totally. Okay, except for a small company that makes documentaries and commercials. Okay, and they hire him to do some stuff. He does it. They don't want it. But he basically writes the scenario for Torero, which was a really important diary type film about Louis Procuna, and he
was nominated for the Academy Awards.
Yeah, but Torero was actually Zavattini's scenario.
Yeah,
okay,
and I actually wanted to ask you about is there proof of that? Because all I knew about Torero was that it was like a Carlos Velo film.
Yeah, of course you did.
I have never seen anyone claim Zavattini as the author of that script. Only you, and I think that's a big deal. That's an important.
It's a huge deal. It's a huge deal. Okay, so Carlos Velo sends him a letter where he thanks him for his help on Torero. That's one piece of evidence. Another piece of evidence comes from one of the film critics and Spanish film critics from the Objetivo team. You'll find it in the book, and he says, this Torero is definitely has Zavattini written all over it, because it's a diary film, because it has nothing to do with this editor called Carlos Velo, who was basically post-production editor on films that were made mostly by a German cinematographer who worked for Producciones Barbacciano. So Zavattini is ignored by mainstream cinema in Mexico. The film buffs, the film culture loves him. One of the journalists publishes a book which is entirely revolves around Zavattini. The writers that Zavattini works with, the team of writers that Zavattini works with in Mexico, Carlos Fuentes, Elena Poniatowska, and other people, develop Zavattini's line of, it's called testimonial narrative.
Yeah.
The testimonial, that testimonio, it's called in Spanish, it's called testimonio, is there in Zavattini from the 1940s and earlier.
Yeah,
it's basically taking the things that are said and written and so on, and taking the witness and making the witness speak.
Yeah, it's almost like a predating of oral history writing.
Exactly, and testimonio develops in the 1950s.
Yeah,
so that's one of the things that happens by the by. Another thing that happens is Nuevo Cine in Mexico tries to start in 1960. The first film they make, the first and only film they make, is a diary film. Zavattini, if you like, is again written all over it. Yeah. The people involved were some of the people who were in the film clubs that Zavattini encouraged to set up a national film club, Mexican film club. So Mexico is that story.
Yeah, sorry, David. No, but what you argue basically in the book is that contrary to his experience in Cuba, in Mexico, he finds a super strong, well-developed film industry that ignores him, that chooses to ignore him because it's like a machine that is well-oiled, and it's producing a bunch of films that sell throughout the world, and they just don't need to renew their national cinema.
Not even Barbacciano, not even the people who had hired him and paid him a lot of money to write screenplays, stories, wanted to actually use that material because it was all, if you like, it was too political.
Exactly. Yeah.
He basically understands that there were two revolutions in Mexico. One was the revolution over the oil industry in Mexico, the expropriation of 1937. So he picks on that as the basis for a film. So of course, Mexico only had a single political party from 1922 or whatever it was till 2000.
Yeah, it's almost until very recently the PRI has been like the Revolutionary Institutional Party. That's the oxymoron is even in their acronym.
So who was deciding what films could be made in Mexico?
Yeah, exactly.
So if you
just very quickly, let's move on to Birri, and if you could say like in a couple of sentences, Argentina is like a completely different case study because Zavattini I think only went once to Argentina later on.
That's correct. He goes to Argentina in 1961. Before that, if you like, his connection with Argentina is through Fernando Birri.
Yeah.
Fernando Birri is credited as being rightly credited as the father of new Latin American cinema, but actually there's a grandfather of new Latin American cinema, and that is Zavattini. Why? Because Birri had, if you like, had worked on a film with Zavattini and Vittorio De Sica, The Roof, Il Tetto, but he also wrote a lot of letters to Zavattini, which, if you like, tell him or tell us what actually happened, how the transmission happened, and what was Birri doing. So Birri, when he goes to Argentina, he takes on this role as the ambassador of neorealism in Argentina to, if you like, to show. So he's like an entrepreneur. He goes from film club to film club, showing Italian neorealist films. And then the new thing is that he goes back to his old university in Santa Fe, and he sets up an evening class in what was a workers' university, Universidad Popular. And that evening class then develops using, if you like, ideas from Zavattini's photo documentaries that were published in the Italian film magazine, Cinema Nuovo. He takes as a template the one that Zavattini put together with with Strand, the photographer, which was called Un Paese. So he takes that, and that becomes a model of practice, of film practice, that then leads to ethnographic ground research with interviews with ordinary people in the nearby environs to Santa Fe, poor people. Zavattini then is involved in editing that film. Birri takes it to Rome. He shows it to Zavattini. Zavattini gives us comments, and those comments are in the correspondence.
But from your book, you have the impression that Zavattini was much less interested in Argentina than Cuba or Mexico. There's even like an episode which is almost tragic to read, where Birri is trying to get a little bit of credit of what he did in Rome, that he was like, he had been like an assistant in Il Tetto, and Zavattini refuses to answer his letters. And it takes him like a year or a couple of years to respond with I think like the problem crediting him. Why is that? Why was he almost comes off as dismissive of Fernando Birri? And I wonder if this was the origin of Fernando Birri's later kind of like pretending not being involved with Zavattini at all.
That there's like everything you say then raises huge issues.
Yeah, I apologize for that.
No, so Birri wanted his name credited as an assistant director, one of the assistant directors in the credits to The Roof.
Yes.
Okay, it wasn't down to Zavattini, that was down to De Sica. De Sica didn't want to do that. He had his own usual crew, a bit like Mike Lee in his films, or Minghella in Doc Martin does the same crew that makes all the films. So De Sica did that as well. The same crew. So Birri was a foreigner who, you know, he let him work, and you know, like other people as well were working, but he was not willing to credit that. So Zavattini intervened, and in the end managed to get something in writing from De Sica, which is very kind of qualified statement that really is saying no, not saying very much. So now the second point you're making is, would that account for his later response? Actually, I found a pattern. I was very interested in that, and last year this year in February or March this year, I would have given a paper about the anxiety amongst, you know, Latin American filmmakers in dealing with transmission. So the issue is more to do with how do you, anxiety is a word that, you know, Harold Bloom uses in a famous book on literature. It's called The Anxiety of Influence. It was published a long time ago, The Anxiety of Influence. And I mean, I'm not really into psychoanalysis myself, but the concept is useful. It's an operative concept, anxiety of influence, in terms of what happens with transmission. What are we willing to admit? How much credit are we willing to give to the bridge, you know, the connection between the before and after, the person who is passing on the news, the person who is carrying, the carrier of a body of knowledge, and the receiver of a body of knowledge. And so I looked into that, and I found that if you look at the 1980s, when there are these first interviews by Europeans and Americans to Latin America and filmmakers, actually Zavattini is not mentioned at all. He's not mentioned at all. So there's a kind of suppression or covering the tracks of that transmission. And Biri, when I interviewed him in 2015, and I filmed that interview, he was furious when he realized that I had a copy of a book that he published in 1964, which is this one. This is a 1986 edition, in which this book is actually like his part. It's a sort of visiting card. This is a collection of all the archival documents that Biri had from the 50s are in here. This is what should be in brown, the papers leading to this. Exactly. But it's all here. So in a way that doesn't matter. It's published.
No, but that's, yeah. But
so he was furious that I had it. Why would he be furious? Why didn't he want to answer my questions? I was asking, okay, how do you know Zavattini? Oh, yes, I worked with Il Tetto. But he didn't say anything about the correspondence. He didn't say anything about having interviewed Zavattini in 1955. How come?
Yeah, probably because, as you said, he wanted to just be the father of new Latin American cinema without acknowledging. He wanted to, not to get too psychoanalytical, but he wanted to kill the father and or kill the grandfather in this case. But I am on that note. I think we have to start reaching an end. But I think it's good because your book, in a way, is uncovering those tracks and is kind of like retracing the Italian influences throughout the continent. And I think it's an important book, a book that sheds new light on this topic. It's pretty consistent. It gives like a panoramic view. So I just wanted to congratulate you. It was a very good read. Just give us in a few short seconds. I know Julian is anxious for us to finish, but
yeah.
What are you working on? I think you're gonna be publishing a cultural biography on Zavattini in English.
I'm just about to bring out 2 books with the same publisher, Bloomsbury Academic. One is a critical biography of Zavattini, and the other one is a 2-volume selected writings. And I've been working on these various books for the last 8 years. So they're finally going into print, should be before the end of this year. So the biography also deals with Spain, which is, if you like, another story there. I actually didn't look into I couldn't possibly look into all his travels, but you know, I have those 3 countries that we talked about, plus Spain, which is also a similar kind of story goes on there. And again, it's the same structure. So there's if you like, critique, interpretation, and then there's archival work to support that. Primary source research, and then supported also by secondary source.
That's great. That's great to know. So Professor Brancaleone, thank you so much for being here with us. This was exciting. It was very interesting. And for the audience out there, thank you very much for being there, for listening. We have another Tutti a Casa next week, every Thursday at 5 p.m. So yeah, thank you very much for being there, and that'll be all. Thank you, Professor.